cognitive thought whatsoever that an emergency scenario could happen to that individual. And what that does in the cranial brain is, if I were to take a song and play it, between the synapses, this substance called myelin, if I play Stairway to Heaven several times, the synapses of playing that song in my brain create a myelin pathway which gets stronger each time I play it. In other words, I get better playing that song. So even if I'm not proactively physically doing a survival skill, just thinking about how to keep my family safe, it promotes that synapse, which makes the shock factor less applicable because I've already been there in my mind. Now, professional athletes have proven that as well. If you take a basketball player and set them up and have them visualize shooting baskets, they're better when they actually shoot baskets. So what does that tell us? Well, there's a whole,
Isn't this the limbic system at work?
Yeah.
What you called making a deeper groove?
About preparedness in general. And that's just, you could do that with making donuts. It doesn't have anything to do with survival skills per se, but people can use it to their advantage. I don't have time for that, Cody. I don't have time to frankly make my family more self-reliant and safer. Oh, well, okay. Well, I'm sure you have plenty of downtime. Turn off the damn TV and at least think about if the grid did go down. I recommend When All Hell Breaks Loose, if you live in your own home, shut off the breakers for a weekend. If you live in an apartment, that's going to piss people off. So just duct tape over the stuff that quote-unquote doesn't work anymore and find out in a little 2-day weekend scenario what makes your family squirm. And then try to remedy that with stuff out of the box or whatever where you're not as reliant on grid power or whatever it is that really makes your family squirm. Just by doing that little exercise, and it can be loads of fun. You can make it a game, especially with kids. You better make it a game. It's not fear-based. It's fun-based. You're going to do this little experiment. We're going to be pioneers. We're not going to have power for 2 whole days. Wow, really? Yeah. And we're going to, what the cool thing that happens in a lot of disasters after they pick up the bodies and the bloated corpses, which is not cool, but what it does is it brings people to a sense of family. And everything finally shuts down, and people get back on a slower pace with life. And I just got done with several courses, so I'm quasi-exhausted in this interview, and I apologize. But I just had a client just days ago tell me with a blizzard, I think it was, that knocked down the power, maybe it was a hurricane, and she didn't have power for about 3 weeks. And she said for the first time in her life in this neighborhood, they got to know all the neighbors. And all the neighbors got together, and all the neighbors worked together, and she said it was a damn good time. We actually had a lot of fun during this crisis.
Don't you think, Cody, that electronics have really taken a great part of the connectedness in the community away from life?
Well, on a human level, yeah. But as far as there's a huge community out there on the internet, whether it has much of a heart connection, that remains to be seen. And I would agree with you on that. But what this woman also said is when the grid power came back on, she said, we haven't talked to our neighbors since. Okay, so, this, I don't know, really what to make of that. But, yeah, we have a huge option with communication now with the internet and telephones and yada, yada, yada. It doesn't mean we're closer as a species at all. I think quite the contrary, like you're saying.
You talk about how people rely on the cell phones, and I think this is a very important thing to talk about because the cell phone tower can go down just as quickly as everything else.
Yeah, and it's going to be overloaded quicker than anything else because everyone's calling Mom or Uncle Fred during a disaster. There's kind of a rule of thought out there that let's say that the grid went down in Houston, for whatever reason, Houston, Texas. Let's call Aunt Martha in Sacramento, California, because usually if you make a long-distance call, a landline or whatever, there's less commotion wherever the disaster did not happen. I'm big into, using communications when they're appropriate, and they can be a lifesaver, obviously. But you better have a plan with your family where if everyone's off to work in town and something happens and no one's at home, that you have a where, what, who, when, etc. about where everyone is. If something happens and a tornado happens or whatever, here's what to do. And you have a written plan with your family that has no moving parts. about where everyone's going to meet, plan A, and if that doesn't work, plan B. That trumps any sort of electronic communication whatsoever because it doesn't require power. It's personal to your family. No batteries required, and that should be a really intimate part of everyone's personal preparedness plan.
What do you think about these little walkie-talkies? I'm talking very inexpensive walkie-talkies to have amongst family members in general if you ever need to use them.
I think communications are worth their weight in gold. We're using those a lot on production now. And when the producer doesn't have to walk 700 yards over scorching desert to communicate with a cameraman, that's worth a lot in the production shoot. And with just common sense value of, wow, I don't have to burn those food calories walking or lose that water. Whatever works, and that'll be custom for each family or each agenda. I'm totally into that. I'm into using primitive technology and modern technology to the advantage of our species in a heart-centered way, obviously. I'm not the roll-in-the-dirt hippie, and I'm not the total tech guy. I can see benefits to them both. What I'm cautioning people about is when you put your lives of your family into a couple batteries, then they better be damn good batteries, and you better have a backup plan B and C as well.
I want to talk about the body. You say that losing 2% of your water in body weight compromises your overall judgment, and being out in 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius will cause you to lose another 25%. Talk about this water balance with hypothermia, with too much heat or too much cold. This is related to core temperature. Talk about these things. This is really important.
Yeah, the biggest way for people to die in the outdoors as an outdoor recreator are two fancy words which mean lack of thermoregulation, which is a third fancy word. One is hypothermia. It's from the Greek, hypo meaning low, thermia meaning heat. The other is hyperthermia, hyper meaning high, thermia meaning heat. So the core is where all the cookies are. It's the torso of the body. It's where all the important organs are, and we would include the head and the neck in that as well. If the interior part of my body gets too cold or too warm, life sucks. And I start to go through signs and symptoms of both of the things that I've mentioned, and those are the biggest ways to die. Now notice, in Chicago, in an apartment in the summertime during a brownout, hyperthermia and dehydration is still the killer that kills those elderly people on the 10th floor of that apartment building in Chicago. So when I say hypothermia and hyperthermia are relegated to outdoor stuff, that's not true. What I mean by that is everything's temperature sensitive on this planet. And if you're down in Phoenix, Arizona in June in your fancy mansion and the power grid goes down, it's going to be a fancy mansion that's hotter than hell inside. So what water does, it helps thermoregulate the body's core temperature via hydration, via the circulatory system, which is the essence of life. You have the airway, you have breathing, and you have the circulatory system. And if the blood turns to ketchup, the circulatory system feeds the cells, eliminates waste products, it oxygenates the cells, it heats the body if it's cold outside, and it cools the body if it's hot outside. So if your blood turns to ketchup, things don't go well. And I'm a huge water advocate because I live in the high desert, and it's horribly wasted in this country. It's embarrassing. States like Colorado have a law where you can't legally catch rain on your own roof. Whoever the hell made that law should be hung by their toenails, because water is a biological necessity down to the cellular level. It's not an optional item. It's one of your most principal things you have to have, or you're dead on this planet. And it's why we poop in it. If you came from a different planet and the people introduced you to their home planet and we only had 4 sacred elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and they crapped in one of them, what would you think about the mental state of that population?
Dangerous.
That remains to be seen.
I would think very little. I thought it was interesting. You talked about a hiker who becomes a 1.5 quart low of water, loses 1/2 of who they are. That's very, very critical to know that for the people that are hiking out there.
Yeah, and that's an intense stat. And usually when people are thirsty, they're already a quart to a quart and a half low.